"You're not allowed to fish here anymore. We've purchased this entire lake," a man shouted while the old man stood motionless, still clutching his weathered fishing rod. He just nodded, silently packing his nets. Not a word of protest. They had no idea who he used to be. It wasn't until the next morning, when military vehicles lined up outside their gate, that everything began to unfold. How would you feel if someone who sacrificed for their country was driven away from their hometown lake? If you find this unjust, type 9 to speak up for forgotten veterans. Raymond was a 74-year-old veteran who had served in the Marines for 2 tours in Vietnam. He lived alone in a small wooden cabin near the lake, where he had fished since his youth, both before and after the war. The locals respected him for his calm demeanor and helpfulness, fixing neighbors' porches, teaching children how to tie fishing knots, sharing fish with those in need. For Raymond, fishing wasn't recreation, it was healing. After years of combat, losing comrades, and nights still haunted by gunfire, the lake was his sanctuary. Then strangers arrived. They had just purchased the land around the lake to build a luxury resort. One morning, as Raymond was preparing to cast his nets, a young man in a suit approached. "Hey, you can't fish here anymore." Raymond looked up, bewildered. "I only fish each morning. I don't harm anyone." "We've just bought this lake. It's private property now." A woman behind him snickered. "He looks like a homeless person." Raymond stood up, quietly rolling up his fishing line. No arguments, no reactions, just bowed his head. "Get out of here before I call the police," the man said loudly, enough for nearby residents to hear. A few people stopped to watch. Some recognized Raymond, but no one spoke up. Before leaving, he turned to look at the lake's surface, then walked slowly home, as if a piece of his soul had just been taken away. The lake had been more than water to him. It was where he'd gone as a boy with his father, where he'd taught neighborhood kids to fish, and most importantly, where the rippling water drowned out the memories of gunfire that still echoed in his mind. As Raymond walked away, the weight of decades seemed to press down on his shoulders. His weathered hands, and the same hands that had carried wounded comrades through jungle firefights, now trembled slightly as they clutched his old tackle box. Behind him, the resort developers already turned their backs, laughing among themselves about cleaning up the local color before their guests arrived. They didn't notice the military dog tags that still hung around the old man's neck, partially hidden by his faded collar. By the time Raymond reached his small cabin, nestled among pine trees at the edge of town, his eyes were dry, but his heart felt hollowed out. He carefully placed his fishing rod in its stand by the door, perhaps for the last time. The next morning, Raymond didn't bring his fishing rod. He only wanted to walk around the lake, as had been his habit for 50 years. But a large security guard was already blocking the trailhead. "You're not permitted to enter. This is private property." "I'm just walking. I've lived here my whole life," he said softly. "We don't care. Please turn around." Raymond nodded slightly. No one saw the tears in his eyes as he turned away. On his way home, he passed the old general store. The owner, whose roof he had once helped patch, only looked at him, then bowed her head in silence. A few familiar faces saw him, including the boy he'd taught how to untangle fish from nets. Nobody dared say anything. In Raymond's heart there was no anger, only a cold ache. He realized in the country he had served, sometimes people forget too quickly who had sacrificed for them. That evening, he quietly took out an old wooden box. Inside were medals, badges, and a photograph with his fellow Marines. In the photo, 2 men had fallen at Khe Sanh. Only he had survived. He lit an incense stick, placed a neatly folded flag on the table, then sat down by the window, looking out at the lake. Not a word of complaint, not a single visitor. The small cabin seemed to sink into the darkness, but in Raymond's heart, the past still burned brightly. His fingers traced the Purple Heart medal that lay beside the photo. The citation read, "For wounds received in action," clinical words that couldn't capture the day he dragged 3 men to safety while bleeding from shrapnel wounds across his back. Outside, crickets began their evening chorus, accompanied by the distant lapping of lake water against the shore. Sounds that had once brought him peace now seemed to mock his isolation. On his small kitchen table, yesterday's newspaper was still open to a story about the new resort development, promising to bring prosperity to the region. Raymond's coffee had gone cold beside it. In the growing darkness, he stood and moved to his closet, where his dress uniform hung, still immaculate after all these years. He ran his fingers over the emblems and ribbons, silent testimonies to courage that now seemed forgotten. A car drove by on the distant road, music blaring, young people laughing, living in the freedom he and his brothers had fought to protect. Raymond didn't begrudge them their joy. That was the point after all. He returned to his chair by the window, watching as lights came on around the far shore of the lake, including the bright floodlights now illuminating the construction site of the resort. Tomorrow they would begin clearing more trees. I'm sorry. My heart aches reading this. How could someone who wore the uniform, who sacrificed for his country, be treated this way? If you also feel this injustice, type UNFAIR to speak up for justice. The next morning, as Raymond was preparing his coffee, the sound of engines roared. Not one vehicle, but a convoy of military trucks lined up outside the resort's gate. American flags flew on each vehicle. At the front of the procession, a captain from the National Guard in full dress uniform. He stepped down, looked directly at the gate, and signaled for his soldiers to form an honor guard. The resort owner rushed out in panic. "What's going on here? This is private property." The captain saluted, then said, "We're here to visit someone. Someone who once saved my father's life. Sergeant Raymond, United States Marine Corps." Silence fell. The lake residents gradually gathered to watch. Raymond emerged from his house wearing his old military jacket with worn shoulders. He was astonished to see the convoy, the solemn soldiers saluting him. The young soldier, the captain, approached, eyes glistening. "You saved my father 50 years ago in Da Nang. He told stories about you every year. Until his death, he kept your photo in his wallet. Yesterday, I learned what happened, and today, we've come to say thank you." Raymond was speechless. He just nodded, then tightly gripped the young soldier's hand. The residents began to applaud. An elderly woman spoke up. "I'm ashamed for staying silent." "I'm sorry, Mr. Raymond." The resort owner stood confused, face pale. His entire group retreated behind him, completely silent. A child brought forward a bouquet of flowers, trembling as they handed it to him. Raymond didn't smile, nor was he angry. He simply stood straight, offering a military salute, and the entire line of National Guardsmen returned it in a solemn silence never before witnessed by the lake. The captain's voice carried across the gathering crowd. "My father spent his life telling me how Sergeant Raymond carried 3 wounded men through enemy fire, how he refused evacuation until others were safe, how he wrote letters to the families of those who didn't make it home." The resort developer shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot. Someone in the crowd whispered loudly enough for all to hear, "That's the man you called homeless yesterday." An older man stepped forward from the gathering residents. "I should have spoken up. Raymond taught my son to fish right here." His voice broke slightly. "On this very shore." Another resident added, "He fixed my mother's roof last winter. Wouldn't take a penny for it." The captain produced an official-looking document. "We've also discovered something interesting about this property. There's a historical easement on the lakeshore, established 50 years ago to honor local veterans. It seems the previous owner failed to disclose this to you." The resort owner sputtered, "That's impossible. Our lawyers would be welcome to review the documentation," the captain finished smoothly. "But I believe you'll find that Sergeant Raymond and all citizens have the legal right to access this shoreline. It's officially designated as a Veterans Memorial Pathway." As murmurs spread through the crowd, Raymond remained silent, standing tall as he hadn't in years. His weathered face revealed nothing, but for the first time in days, the weight seemed to lift from his shoulders. As the convoy prepared to leave, a young soldier turned back, planting a small wooden sign by the lake. "Area dedicated in honor of Sergeant Raymond, a Marine who lived with honor." Those around stood in silence, then one by one removed their hats, bowing their heads. No apology came from the resort owner, only awkward, embarrassed silence. But Raymond didn't need them to bow their heads. He only needed to know someone still remembered. That afternoon, the lake was calm, and Raymond, for the first time in many years, cast his line again. Not to catch fish, but to tell himself that he still belonged here. The following week, something unexpected happened. Local residents began appearing at the lake each morning, some with fishing rods, others simply walking. They nodded respectfully to Raymond, sometimes joining him in comfortable silence. The resort construction continued, but with modified plans. The lakeshore path remained open to all, and the developer, perhaps seeking to salvage his reputation, announced a new wing would be named Veterans Hall. Raymond neither sought nor needed the recognition. For him, it was enough to sit by the water, feeling the morning sun on his face, listening to the lap of waves against the shore, sounds that had always reminded him he was home. War had taught him that some battles are fought with weapons, while others with quiet dignity and unwavering principle. And sometimes justice arrives in unexpected ways. Some people never ask to be remembered, but we owe them our deepest respect. Subscribe to Iron Soul Stories if you believe kindness and honor should be protected to the end. Iron Soul Stories. Because some heroes never stop serving.